I discovered my wife's infidelity the way most men do. She told me she was divorcing me. I will admit it came as a bit of a surprise, as I had thought we were the ideal couple. Our love life seemed normal enough, and Diane didn't seem to be out of the house any more than I would expect. I was pretty busy at work, but I don't think you could describe me as inattentive at home. Anyway, she presented me with her decision, 2 suitcases of my clothes, the information that I had reservations at the nearest moto lodge for the next 2 nights, and that her boyfriend was moving in that night, so I had better skedaddle. A fine start to my weekend. Now I'm quite sure there are those amongst you who will say that I should have dug in, turfed her out on her arse, and beaten the crap out of Loverboy. But you have to remember that at this stage I was completely off balance. I loaded my cases into the car and left in a complete daze. I probably shouldn't have been driving, but I didn't hit anything or kill anyone en route to the hotel. I booked in and went to my room. It was quite nice, I thought. A 3-quarter bed and a large double, tea and coffee, small kettle, TV, a small settee, an ensuite bathroom with shower over. The walls were an acceptable shade of beige, with the color being injected by the bedding, curtains, and soft furnishings. There were the usual pieces of what I call furniture art on the wall. The perfect, bland setting that will not annoy anyone except the most rabid design freaks. I was quite happy with the room. It was pleasant and functional, and did nothing to increase my distress. Now, some would have cried, some would have ranted and raged, some would have rolled onto the bed and lain in stunned silence. I undressed. I took a nice hot shower. I dressed in clean clothes. I left the room, drove to a local inn, and had a very passable meal. I found a local shop and selected some bottled water. I wasn't going to fill the kettle from the tap in the bathroom. Very few hotels pipe fresh water direct to the rooms, and you never know what has fallen into the water tanks. I looked out at the local off-license across the road and decided to buy some Coke and a carton of orange juice as well. Then I crossed the road and bought a bottle of rum. I would have preferred Guianan, but settled for the God knows whose brand, as it was the only dark rum they had. I returned to my room and administered my chosen sleeping draft. After consuming the best part of a bottle of cheap rum, I awoke with a mouth that would kill at 1,000 paces, a head that couldn't decide whether it was sore or still drunk, and a stomach that was undecided about its preferred location. I drank half the carton of orange juice as I changed into some sports gear and running shoes. The juice doesn't really help with the hangover, but it makes your vomit taste nice. I went for a long run. Mind you, in the state I was in, anything further than my own length constituted a long run. I found the towpath and ran along the canal. After about a mile, my stomach decided it wanted out. Anywhere else it would have been pavement pizza, but here I was able to project about a quarter of the way across the canal. It was very wide at this point. Honestly, that set the tone for the next mile. I was glad of the orange juice. I turned at the lock gates and returned to the hotel feeling much fresher. Showered, freshly dressed, and having made good use of my toothpaste and the courtesy mouthwash, I made my way to the dining room. The breakfast was surprisingly comprehensive for a motorway chain hotel. There was fresh grapefruit, fruit juice, cereal, small breads, toast, full English breakfast, and copious amounts of tea or coffee. I must admit, I pigged out. What's more, after the run, everything stayed down. Replete, I returned to my room. I needed to sort out what I was going to do. Firstly, I phoned my solicitor. I know it was Saturday, but since he was also one of my best mates, I knew his phone number. David, it's Jack. Hi, Jack. David always greeted me that way. A standing joke? I know what this call is about, and I'm really sorry, but I can't represent you. Diane came to me to file. I told her I couldn't handle the case because of conflict of interest, so I called in my partner, and he's dealing with her. Shit. David cut in before I could say anything more. Fret not, my dear boy, I wouldn't represent you anyway. Divorce law is not our greatest strength. Phone Mila, she is expecting your call. I don't think I have her number here. Are you using your mobile? Oh yeah, of course. I'm not firing on all cylinders yet. Surprise, do exactly everything Mila tells you, and don't hold anything back from her. She is very good, but only as good as the information you give her. Give her everything you've got, and she'll really cover your arse. I'll see you at the clubhouse in the morning. But don't talk to me about the divorce. It'll only mess up your case since we're representing Diane. Thanks, David.
I am
Jack, get your effing arse into gear and phone her now. We'll talk later, and I'll tell you what we can and cannot discuss. I'll see you in soon. Bye. I took David's advice and phoned Camilla, or Milla, as we knew her. Good morning, Jack. Hi, Milla. David tells me you're expecting this call. Sadly, yes. When did you find out? Last night. So, she moved pretty quick. She was only in with David yesterday. Where are you? The Moto Lodge. Are you sober? No, let me rephrase that. How much did you drink last night? Best part of a bottle of rum. Don't drive. I'll pick you up. When can you be ready? I am ready now. I'll believe that when I see it. 45 minutes. I see ya. Bye. Milla collected me, drove to her office, and started to sort my future. Right, go put the kettle on. I'll take a coffee. I trotted off to the kitchen and did as I was told. When I returned to her office, she had everything ready. From what David told me, she has started the ball rolling, so she should be paying. But you can rest assured she'll try to plead poverty and claim legal aid. That'll land you with the bills. We'll have to head that one off at the pass. But first things first, can she lay her hands on your money? Well, she has her own bank accounts. We have a joint account for housekeeping and the kids. There's a joint credit card on it, but my salary goes into a personal account. Savings, pensions, investments, mortgage? Mostly in my name. I'll get a full statement on Monday morning. Shit, most of the records are at home. The joint account is useful. We'll direct the maintenance pending suit into that, and you can get statements to see how much she is using. Cancel the credit card. The what? You're still liable for your share of the family budget. If we make some payments right from the off, it'll sit better with the judge. Especially when we go for custody. Why am I paying maintenance when she has moved Loverboy in already? Oh, she has. Has she? That was a mistake. We can limit the maintenance, but we still pay it. Honestly, it will look a lot better for you. The stupid which shouldn't have moved Loverboy, as you call him, in quite that quickly. Alan will not be happy. Alan? David's partner? The solicitor acting for Diane? Oh, yeah. I'm a bit slow on the uptake at the moment. Yes, well, no more bad drink for a while. You are going to be as pure as the driven snow at least until this is settled. Now, any other financials I need to know about? There's no mortgage. The house technically belongs to Mom and Dad. It's a sort of family trust, and we pay rent. Excellent. I'll need to talk to your parents. We'll serve her with a notice to quit. Hang on a sec, Milla. I can't just throw her and the kids out of the house. Jack, you have to realize she is in the driving seat at the moment. You need to throw her of balance and take charge here. If you don't, she is going to take you to the cleaners. But I don't know what you want to do, I know. But let's get one thing straight here, Buster. You do as I say, and I'll protect your position and the kids. She'll get as near screw-all as I can sort. The notice to quit is exactly that, a notice. We aren't saying get out immediately, and we make no mention of the children being put out. We can make a motion for you to have temporary custody of them in the home they're used to. It just makes things awkward for her. They're the house on the south coast. It's paid for too, I said. Camilla was spitting feathers. I knew she could be ruthless, but I had never seen her in full battle order. In fact, she rarely swore. The number of swear words coming out of her mouth were a measure of just how angry she was. I'd put it at 9.5 on a 10-point scale. David, Camilla, and I had all grown up together. We had always looked out for each other, and it was quite clear that she considered Diane's actions as much an attack on her as me. The rest of the morning was pretty much in the same vein. Milla extracted all the information she needed and put everything in place for her staff to draw up all the papers she needed on Monday morning. Her final business of the morning was explicit enough. Go get you gear from that squalid little doss house. You'll stay with Simon and me until we get you back on an even keel. By then I should have you back in the house. It's not that bad. Don't care. You're not staying there any longer than necessary. Well, you're going to have to drive me back to get my gear. An hour and a half later, I was unpacking in Milla and Simon's. My time at Milla and Simon's gave me some time to think about my life. Perhaps I should introduce myself. I am John Nelson Winters. The Nelson bit is mother's maiden name, and yes, there is some connection to the hero of the Nile and Trafalgar. At one stage, the family had been quite wealthy, but that was before the First World War. My father was in the army and my sisters and I went to boarding schools. Home was an old farmhouse owned by my grandparents. We lived there as and when Dad's postings allowed, but got to see a fair bit of the world as well. David and Camilla lived nearby. They studied law and I studied engineering. They went into practice from college and I went into the Navy as an engineering officer. I had intended to make the Navy my career, but then the Berlin Wall came down. The government decided to cut back on the armed forces and asked for volunteers for early release, i.e. redundancies. They were going to do it in tranches. I quickly realized that would mean a lot of guys looking for jobs. I was only 27, had a degree, and experience. I did not want to be competing with a lot of others for whatever jobs were available, and I certainly did not want to be pushed out further on down the line. I wanted some degree of control, so I bid for release in the first tranche. It was definitely my best move. I was offered a number of positions and selected one with a property development company. I was responsible for all the electromechanical installations. I did very well and learned a lot about the rest of building industry. That's how I met Diane. She was the PA to one of the architects we worked with. She definitely knew about presentation. She looked like a model. Even on site, she made personal safety clothing look glamorous. She was 3 years younger than me. Great fun to be with, and after about a year of courting, I proposed and she accepted. We married just before my 30th birthday and decided to get on with having a family straight away. Just over a year later, Henry was born, and 2 years after that, Georgina arrived. Diane didn't lose all her curves after the births, but you would be hard pushed to call her plump. Even so, she was more the classic Marilyn Monroe, or maybe I should say Sophia Loren, since she is brunette, which I preferred anyway. Diane became a stay-at-home mom. As I said earlier, we lived in a property on Mom and Dad's land. It had been a fair-sized farm at one time, but over the years bits had been sold off to pay death duties and so on. The cottage stood on the small patch of land which we had retained around the family house. Harry and Georgie, as the kids were known, had plenty of room to roam, and Mom and Dad had ponies for them both in the stables. Diane was an accomplished horsewoman, and since I had been brought up with my own pony, we would often ride out as a family. With my payoff from the Navy, my salary, and no need for a mortgage, we had a pretty good lifestyle. Once the kids were big enough, Mom and Dad would take them for a weekend every month or two. Diane and I would take the ferry to France, or book into a small hotel somewhere and make like honeymooners. Once the cheap flights began, we would take the odd city break to Paris, Rome, Berlin, Amsterdam, and so on. Then we bought a weekend house in Devon near the coast. When the kids were bigger, they and their mother would spend the school holidays by the sea. I would spend the weekends with them, and also when we had contracts in the Southwest. I suppose the rot set in when both Harry and Georgie were in secondary school. Diane took a job in a boutique. The whole milieu of the place was thin, thin, thin. Diane felt fat, so she started fitness training and going to the gym. Loverboy was one of the trainers. I was pretty broken up over the breakup. Milla and Simon acted as a sounding board when I wanted someone to talk to and gave me space when I didn't. I had been Mr. Responsible Citizen all my life. For the first 20-odd years, I had done my growing and dreaming, got my education, and entered adulthood. The next 20-odd, I had served the nation, contributed to the economy, and brought up a family. Now at 45, I was being dumped on. I realized that there was little chance of saving my marriage. Diane had changed when she re-entered the workplace. I suppose it's an inevitable result of our modern lifestyles. The woman watches her husband climb the promotion ladder. He puts up with the shit to provide for his family, and then reaches the point where he dishes it out instead of taking it. She, in the meantime, spends her time cooped up in the home thinking hubby must be having a great time out in the big wide world. Then the kids are at secondary school and can look after themselves till Mom and Dad get home, so Mom re-enters the workplace. There she finds the excitement and buzz that she missed bringing up the children. Hubby, meanwhile, has time to review his life and starts to ask how it matches up to his teenage dreams. He looks at all the things he wanted to do and the things he didn't do because he hadn't the money or the time because of work and family. He decides that now is the time to fulfill as many of his dreams as he can before his body stops him. So now the wife is moving in one direction and the husband wants to move in another. The common goal of raising the family no longer unites them. This is where Diane and I had arrived. At least I could look at my children, my time in the Navy and in industry, and say I had done more than most men my age. I had few regrets. I still had at least another 20 years of reasonable health to fill with memories to mull before I got to the stage where Dylan Thomas says we have to rage against the dying of the light. And believe you me, I do not intend to go quietly into that dark good night. Sad as I was at the loss of what had been a good marriage, Diane had forced me into a decision. Time to move on. Diane closed the door behind her husband and watched through the window as he loaded his cases into the car. She had thought she would feel more, but all she felt was a sort of numb relief. At least he hadn't made a scene. But then that was never Jack's way. He always seemed so in control. Just once she would have liked him to show some emotion. She turned to see Peter waiting at the door to the kitchen. He held out his arms, and her resolve broke. She ran to him, clutching him close. She buried her head into his chest and burst into tears. She couldn't see his face as he held her tightly, and a small smile played across his face. He put his hands on either side of her face and tipped her head to look into her eyes. He looked so sad as he tried to reassure her. It had to be done, my love. You couldn't live two lives. You said yourself he deserved better, and so do you, he whispered to her. Then he held her in a full embrace, and she felt a sense of finality. Her decision was made. Now, all she had to do was live with it. Diane went into the sitting room where Harry and Georgie sat side by side on the settee. Diane quailed at the look the children gave her. Peter had followed her in. As he did so, Georgie leapt from her seat, ran at him screaming. She kicked his shins and pummeled his chest with her clenched fists and shouted, "I want my daddy! I want my daddy!" Her brother stood up and looked at his mother with dead eyes and ran to his little sister. Engulfing her in his arms, he led her from the room. Diane looked at Peter. He had been completely surprised by Georgie's tirade and hadn't even tried to protect himself. The look of shock on his face told her that he was out of his depth with the children. She had a lot of work to do to bring them all through this and establish a new family. Diane said, "I'd better make supper." "I'll help," said Peter. As she went about the mundane actions of preparing the meal, she thought of how she had brought them to this point. The whistle of the kettle brought Diane back to the reality of her present situation. She turned to find that Peter had the table laid, and all she had to do was serve. She went to call the children for their meal. She found them in Georgie's room. Harry held his sister. As she shuddered through each body-trembling sob, her son's tear-rimmed glare lanced through her. For the first time in her life, Diane was aware of the result of her actions. For years, either everything had fallen just as she wanted, or she had her parents or Jack to back her up. This time she knew she was on her own. Peter couldn't help to explain things to the children, and she had just sent packing. The one man she knew could. "Why did you do this to us?" Harry demanded. "Supper's ready," Diane offered tentatively. "Why did you do this to us?" Harry repeated. "We'll talk after supper, darling," she pleaded. Harry snorted. "Georgie." He spoke quietly to his sister. "Georgie, supper's ready. Let's go eat." "I want my daddy," she answered flatly. "I know, so do I, but we have to have supper. We'll see daddy soon." Mila packs a lot more punch than Alan. It's probably something to do with Simon being a high court judge. Diane and her paramour were out of the house within the week. Diane's actions had pretty much told everyone everything they needed to know, especially the kids. They knew Mummy had a new man and didn't want Daddy around. So she was the one breaking up the family. I was the one who fought to get them back. I didn't have to fight too hard, mind you. As Mila said, Diane shouldn't have moved Loverboy in quite so quickly. She argued that I had nowhere to live. Diane was the petitioner and could just as easily move in with LB. And that moving him into the family home so quickly was not good for the children's psychological and emotional well-being. She pointed out that I was continuing to pay my share into the joint account, that I had moved out immediately Diane demanded it, and the problems presented by the ownership and location of the property. Like I said, Mr. Responsible Citizen. The judge directed that she move out and I move back in, pending the full hearing. She, yes, it was a female judge, directed that the children should stay in the family home, but Diane was to have full access. Mila and I had discussed restrictions, but Mila suggested we adopt a fairly non-confrontational pose, for the moment. Once I was back in my home with the children, I got them into a new routine as quickly as possible. Essentially, there were only two real changes. They went to their grandparents' house until I came home, and their mother was now a visitor. Yes, that's right. She came over most evenings to see them. I stayed out of her way when she was there, and she had to leave so they could do their homework. We alternated Saturdays and Sundays at the weekends. To begin with, Diane tried to explain herself to me, but I was not ready to listen to her. I had made my decision to move on, and that is what I was doing. I wasn't contesting the divorce, but that doesn't mean that things went smoothly. It all fell apart over the reason for the divorce and the ancillary relief, as the courts call it, and of course, the children. I learned that there are 5 reasons for divorce in English law: adultery, unreasonable behavior, desertion, separation with consent, and separation without consent. The consent bit is where both parties to the divorce agree or disagree to the action. If both parties agree, they have to have been separated for 2 years, otherwise it has to be 5 years. Our options boiled down to adultery or unreasonable behavior. Diane couldn't petition on the grounds of her adultery, only I could do that. So she wanted to cite me using unreasonable behavior. I wasn't about to let her blame me, nor was I about to pay her costs. My position was that if she tried to cite me for unreasonable behavior, I would cross-petition on the grounds of adultery. A contested case would lead to expense and time. Ancillary relief is the money side of things. Naturally, this also depends on who has custody of the children. English courts generally divide the assets equally. Since I had been the higher earner and owned more of the assets, I was going to be hit hardest. The family home was also a problem. The mother usually gets custody of the children, but I was not about to roll over on this either. I was damned if I was going to lose contact with them, and that happens all too easily. Camilla proposed that we use this as leverage to get Diane to settle using an arbitrator. I hadn't heard of this, but when she explained it to me, I thought it held promise. Broadly, the arbitrator would listen to both sides and any agreements we had in place. If there were any disagreements over property or custody, for example, they could help sort them out. The big advantage for me was that there is no appeal to an arbitrated settlement. There were other advantages too, such as speed and cost. The main problem would be to get Diane to agree to arbitration. That meant that I might have to give a bit more, but I would save on costs. More importantly, not only could I have more say in placement of the children, but they could have more say also. Milla and I thrashed out an outline of a settlement. She stopped me being too dogmatic about things and included some loss leaders, as she called them. Things that we would be prepared to bargain away in order to hold on to something else. The next move was to get Diane to agree to arbitration. Milla engaged David in the plan, and he did a bit quite unethical subliminal work on Alan, preparing him for our proposal. When Milla put it forward, he was not entirely receptive to it, but he was obliged to put it to Diane anyway. Naturally, she rejected it out of hand. Milla then prepared the paperwork for the court case and started by demanding information about Diane's income. This was followed by a request for information about her parents' financial position and details about their bank accounts, in particular, any funds they were concealing on her behalf. Subsequently, she asked for information on Loverboy Peter's income and business interests. This last was most pertinent because he was a part owner of the gym where they had met. All of this was forwarded to Alan, and when each request was passed to Diane, she simply ignored it. We let things sit for a week, and then started to pressurize Alan for the information. In her letter, Milla suggested that the information was being withheld so that funds could be concealed. She suggested that if the information were not forthcoming, it would be necessary to request it through the courts. She therefore demanded the addresses of Diane's parents, Peter's address, Peter's partners' names and addresses, and all the relevant details about the gym accounts and the accountants responsible for preparing them. Alan already had everything he had asked for from my side. Milla was absolutely on the ball. If this came to court, we smelt of roses while Diane didn't. Things were not going well for Diane. She had expected to remain in the home with the children and for Jack to settle on her terms. Things didn't happen that way. To begin with, the children became extremely willful and the atmosphere in the house deteriorated so quickly that Peter stayed in his flat to allow them to settle down. Then Diane was served with the notice to quit and an emergency court hearing. Suddenly, she was out of the house and had nowhere to go but Peter's. She had daily access to the children, but Jack had ensured that the terms meant that she could not stay overnight. This was promptly followed by the proposal for arbitration and then the request for financial information. When she told Peter about the request for information about the business, he told her that his partners would not be forthcoming. Then Alan told her that if the information was not provided voluntarily, then John's solicitor would request it through the courts, and anyone withholding it could be held in contempt and may be liable to fines or imprisonment. The strain told on her. She was comfort eating and then starving herself. Her hair lost its sheen and her skin was either dry or too oily. Her weight went up and down and she felt listless all the time. Her libido dropped. She couldn't understand why Jack was doing all this. She had always been able to get him to do what she had wanted. Right from the first kiss. After the night at the theater, Jack found Diane to the forefront of his thoughts, more and more, to the extent that he did something he had never done before. He sent flowers and another invitation to Diane's home. From this, the romance gained pace. They spent time together like teenagers at the cinema, dancing, walks at the seaside, countryside, woods and hills. It was the fifth date that Diane decided she had better give him a test run in the bedroom. After an evening of dinner and dancing, where, as usual, Jack, as the driver, had refrained from drinking, they returned to Diane's flat. Diane, too, had been careful about her drinks. Like Jack, she had drunk water with her meal and had only had 2 glasses of wine towards the end of the evening. She wanted to make sure this evening was one that Jack would remember for the right reasons. She also wanted to make sure she would remember it so she could make the right decision. This time, she invited him in for a nightcap. When she offered him alcohol, there was no need to explain what she intended, and Jack unknowingly acquiesced to her plan. For a short time, the arena was the large sofa in the drawing room. As Jack nuzzled Diane's neck and unbuttoned her blouse, she drew back and, taking his hand, led him to her bed. Jack treated her as if she was a virgin. As they lay down, he caressed her body firmly, kissing her urgently, but as gently as a butterfly. He stroked her hair and neck, drifting his fingers down the length of her body and slowly back again. He undressed her. They had sex. They lay linked and entwined in that blurred, unfocused moment as their bodies bobbed on the ebb of their climax. Diane snuggled into her lover with a smilingly contented sigh. Jack held her in that secure, lover's hold, as his contentment, too, lit his face. Both drifted into a deep, easy, refreshing sleep. Diane woke first. She stretched languidly, savoring her sensations of her own body. The sunlight, filtered through the curtains, bathed her bedroom in a warm glow. She lay quietly re-experiencing the previous night. Turning, she looked at the man who had ridden her to a level of sensory experience she had rarely felt before. His tousled hair, relaxed features, and warm light filling the room gave his a very appealing boyish look. Yet the set of his jaw seemed to hint at more than boyishness. Diane had her final answer. This one was not going to be thrown back in. She slid from the bed, pulled on her kimono dressing gown, dealt with her morning needs, and headed for the kitchen. The breakfast tray was quickly set for 2 with fresh grapefruit, orange juice, buttered toast, bacon, and tea. On re-entering the bedroom, she set the tray to the side and awakened Jack. He stretched, looked around to regain his bearings, looked at Diane and smiled. His smile stoked a hotness in her belly, but this was not the time. Breakfast? She asked, climbing in beside him with the tray. Jack caressed the back of her neck, pulling her close and, closed-mouthed, kissing her gently. Sorry, he said, morning breath. Diane handed him the dish of grapefruit. This will clean your mouth, then we can see where things go, smiling coquettishly. Breakfast was one of the most companionable meals Diane had shared. Having eaten, Jack excused himself to use the bathroom. Lack of a toothbrush was overcome when he found mouthwash and floss on the cabinet. Combined with the old toothpaste on the finger trick, Jack felt a little less self-conscious. Diane was sitting up in the bed. Jack started to dress. Diane looked at him and raised a questioning eyebrow. I'm taking you out for the day, he stated. I'm nipping home to change for the seaside. And who says I want to go out? And what if I don't want to go to the seaside? Tough. We're going. We? Yes. Get ready. I'll be back in an hour. He bent forward and Diane kissed him passionately. Make that half an hour, he said. I won't be dressed in half an hour, she teased. If you aren't, we might not get out today. Someone has a high opinion of themselves. She laughed. Just wait. That was the start of a very happy day and a very short courtship. Diane had decided Jack was going to be her husband and father of her children. He had no say in the matter. To that end, Diane was the perfect girlfriend and fiancée. Jack never saw that he had been hooked, played, and landed. He simply fell in love with a beautiful woman who knew how to behave and dress on every occasion, who was fun to be with, who was witty and intelligent, and who made him feel he was the center of her universe. Diane's view was unclouded by sentiment. She saw a man with a degree of social standing she had never had, a career, not only with a good income, but with prospects of promotion or mobility, capital, a stable family background, and a steady future for herself and her children, the minimum requirements on her shopping list. That he was a very attractive man, adventurous, entertaining, an attentive and accomplished lover, and actually in love with her, were all the factors that would make her life as a married woman pleasant rather than tolerable. It's not that Diane was a completely unfeeling person. It's just that she wasn't particularly sentimental. She did like the way Jack made her feel. She liked it when he was happy, and she understood the link between them, but she just didn't feel that, for her, it was the most important part of the relationship. Had you asked her about it, she wouldn't even have realized that there was something absent from her relationship with Jack. Now she realized there was something beyond her control. She really didn't understand what it was. She just knew that things were not going her way, and she didn't like it. Diane couldn't quite understand where or how things had slipped from her control. She had worked so hard to ensure that her timetable was met. When she first met Jack, she had other prospects in play, but from the moment she kissed him, she had cooled them. Once she bedded Jack, they were out of the picture entirely, and all her skills were used to elicit his proposal of marriage. Jack had been a loving and attentive husband, but Diane had no intention of spending her whole life tied to one man and his goals. She had proved her femininity by marrying a good prospect and producing 2 children. She had been a dutiful wife, supporting her husband in his career, attending the tedious business functions to ensure his promotion, and adhering to Jerry Hall's tenets of being a maid in the living room, a cook in the kitchen, and a 304 in the bedroom. She had even played the dutiful daughter-in-law, agreeing with Jack's mother most of the time, but showing enough character to obtain respect as well. She had looked after Harry and Georgie as the best mother should, helping with homework, teaching them to cook and ride, playing in the garden and at the beach. In fact, to any observer, Jack and Diane had the perfect marriage, and that included Jack. Nevertheless, Diane regarded her marriage as a hiatus in her life. She had been extremely good at her job and had great prospects herself. She would have a husband to support her through the early years of her children's lives. But once they were old enough, she intended to return to making a career for herself and enjoying all aspects of her life. Not for her, a life of domesticated decline. Once she had proven her motherliness, Diane would forge her own future again. This would be financed from the divorce settlement. Not for nothing did she endure the rubber chicken dinners and warm champagne and tasteless strawberries of corporate hospitality. Since she was being a dutiful wife, Jack would have to provide the capital for the next phase of her life. His advancement was to her benefit and therefore her duty to herself. Thus far, her life plan had gone to schedule. She held Jack in deep affection and high regard. She believed that he loved her, and she had done her best to nurture that love. She did not have any feelings, though, that she would call love. The one slight complication had been meeting Peter. With him, she felt something that she had never felt before. There was an excitement she had never felt before. Her heart lifted when she saw him, and a sexual frisson ran through her. His entry into her life brought forward her timings. Did the acceleration of her plans produce the loosening of her control on events, or was it something she had not understood about her husband? After the children were born, Jack's parents had arranged to keep them over a weekend every couple of months. This allowed Jack and Diane to spend some time together. Diane appreciated the break from routine and the opportunity to indulge in an abandonment in the bedroom that wasn't possible with 2 small children under the same roof. It was during one of these weekends that they traveled to Devon to look for a holiday home for both weekends and the school holidays. Since they had no mortgage to pay, they decided to invest in a property of their own. Needless to say, Diane also had her long-term plan in mind. Any such property was jointly owned and would be part of any settlement. Jack took the Friday off work as time owed. He was no longer on a pay scale where he got overtime, but he worked as each job required and was permitted time off in lieu of hours worked outside his contract. They arrived in Plymouth to visit the local estate agents for advice on property for sale. Having spent the morning and early part of the afternoon collecting brochures on various properties, they went to a pub overlooking the harbors for lunch. As they entered, Diane heard someone declaim loudly and clearly, "Bloody hell, it's armless." This, of course, meant nothing to Diane, but Jack turned to the source of the call and responded, "Oh no, not you lot. I thought I'd got rid of you." Plymouth is home to Devonport Dockyard, a major Royal Navy base. Sailors from one of the warships in port had also chosen the pub they had selected for lunch. These sailors had previously served on different ships with Lieutenant Winters RN. The group invited Jack and Diane to join them, and whilst Jack was inclined to decline, Diane accepted the invitation. What woman could resist a testosterone-charged group of fit, strong men like these? Apart from that, she thought she might find out a little more about her husband. Jack didn't talk much about his time in the Navy. Introductions were made, but Diane could hardly catch the names. The accents covered the whole of the British Isles, including Ireland, North and South. The afternoon was one of reminiscence and storytelling, with much, "Do you remember?" and "What happened to?" The pub rocked to their laughter. During the course of the storytelling, Jack and Diane got divided. The sailors, however, did not let Diane become excluded. She was included in every round of drinks bought. They considered it a point of honor to ensure her glass was always full and that she was included in the conversation. So engrossing was the companionship, Diane barely noticed how much she was drinking. But there again, she seemed to keep her wits about her. It was one of those afternoons where the camaraderie surpasses the effects of alcohol. Diane learned that Jack had had a number of nicknames during his service. His first was FC. This he had received on his first ship. As a sub-lieutenant, he had been officer of the watch. The crew comprising the watch had not discharged their duty to the standard required by their officer, and as a result he had disciplined them by assigning extra duty. The petty officer of the watch, P.O. McVeigh, thought he could browbeat the new officer into rescinding his decision, but Jack had stood his ground. He was christened effing Cold Winters because of the icy manner he used to deal with the P.O. At least that's what Diane was told. Actually, the P.O. called him that effing Winters, and that had stuck as FC. His second ship christened him One-Eyed Jack. This was a fairly typical ratings jibe that worked on a number of levels. Jack was known to have a certain skill at cards, despite gambling being prohibited. He was also a member of the ship's boxing team. An officer is always a prime target in these competitions and can expect no quarter. Jack had received a thumb in the eye during one fight and had to wear an eye patch for a time. This, combined with his middle name of Nelson, earned him the One-Eyed Super K. It was aboard this same ship that he received his final nickname. Damage control has long been a drill extensively practiced in the Royal Navy. It is exactly what it says. If the ship is damaged by nature or enemy action, all rates are trained to take action to prevent damage getting worse and causing the ship to sink. There are groups formed of sailors whose role is not directly involved in fighting. They are the damage control party whose role is to take over and do running repairs to maintain the viability of the vessel. Jack was supervising a drill involving some new equipment. A screw jack was being used to brace two beams. The DC party were working beneath it when it suddenly slipped. Jack saw this and shoved a man out from below it as it fell. The prop fell on his outstretched arms and broke both of them. A naval board of inquiry was established into the accident. All personnel taking part were required to give evidence at the shore establishment, which is called a ship, even though it is a land-based building. It was established that there was a fault with the equipment, and a signal was sent to the fleet advising new procedures. Once the finding was handed down, the men from Jack's ship retired to a local hostelry to celebrate. Jack, of course, caused much hilarity trying to drink with both arms and plaster. Unfortunately, amongst the other patrons was a group including P.O. McVeigh, who had spent most of the afternoon in the bar. McVeigh approached Jack. The other sailors from Jack's crew were not aware of the history between the pair. until McVeigh offered to help Jack with his beer. He promptly poured it over the officer's head, slurring something about Jack being unable to respond because he was harmless due to being armless. As he turned to walk away, he stumbled and fell. Getting up, he accused Jack of tripping him and swung a wild punch at Jack. Jack dodged the punch and brought his plaster-reinforced forearm sharply up below McVeigh's chin, jerking his head back. McVeigh sank to the floor with a soft grunt. Jack swore loudly as the partially set bones flexed despite their casing. The bar staff called the ambulance, and as a result, the shore patrol arrived as well. These men are the naval equivalent of the military police, except in one respect. No one, absolutely no one, argues with shore patrol. Their main duty is to police the bars of the port towns when ships are in port. If the vessel has been on a long cruise, the sailors will indulge to the extreme. S.P. Deal with troublemakers quickly and efficiently. Many civilians who get involved in fights with sailors have ended up in the brig, only to be released the next morning, ruining the time they swung at a member of the SB. Appeals to the police about wrongful arrest are not favorably received. The local constabulary generally knows that it is not a good idea to antagonize the Navy, or they may be left to deal with a ship's company celebrating the end of a long period with very little alcohol. Naturally, the involvement of a senior rate and an officer meant that there was another board of inquiry at which Jack was exonerated and P.O. McVeigh was reduced in rank to able seaman, imprisoned and discharged with loss of his pension and gratuity for service. The sentence not only reflected the seriousness of an assault on an officer and the fact that the officer was incapacitated before the incident, but also McVeigh's record of incompetent behavior. Having finally been able to establish a watertight case against him, the Navy threw the book at him. The incident gave Jack the nickname Harmless. These stories and many others portray Jack as an officer well respected by those who served under him, but also one who was not averse to taking direct action when he felt it was necessary. This was a lesson that Diane had missed. The afternoon in the bar stretched into the evening, and when a group set up for the evening entertainment, Diane was caught up in a whirl of dancing and laughter. At one point, one of Jack's erstwhile command disappeared to talk to the band. He returned to cajole Jack into performing his party piece. Jack's reluctance was easily overcome by the combination of drink taken and peer pressure. He joined the band to perform his own version of the Johnny Cash classic, I've Been Everywhere. This version involved the names of various places visited by all the ships on which Jack served. Despite being a little inebriated, his ability to get through the place names of foreign ports was impressive and received uproariously by the sailors, other patrons, and the band alike. Knowing it was best to leave on a high, Jack called a taxi and he and Diane retired to their hotel. Spending an afternoon in the presence of so much rampant testosterone deferring to her man had its effect on Diane, and they were barely into the bedroom before she had him clenched in a one-armed embrace whilst she hurriedly unfastened his trousers, moved on to Jack, and drilled herself passionately. Jack held on for the ride. Next morning, they woke still fully dressed. They made love, gently and sweetly this time, before showering, dressing, and breakfasting. The rest of the weekend was spent visiting properties and compiling a short list of you again. Milla had prevented Jack from being vindictive in the terms and had drawn up a settlement which she felt was favorable to him and would be accepted by the arbitrator. The only unresolved aspect was the children. Whilst Jack wanted sole custody, she calculated that a joint custody agreement would be passed more easily. She had also sought to protect Jack's naval and company pensions and his gratuity by offsetting them against the Devon property. Diane had her own pension plan, and the investment had been maintained from the joint account since she had given up work. If she tried to claim against Jack's pension, they would claim from hers. The Range Rover was already in Diane's name, and Jack would relinquish any claim on it. She would also receive a lump sum settlement from savings and investments made during the marriage. Jack's ace was the part share he had bought in the boutique. It had been intended as an anniversary gift, but now it represented an inducement to settle. Whilst it was more than Jack wanted to give her, the quid pro quo was joint custody of the children. Milla had talked to the children independently, and their preference was to stay with their father in their own home. They wanted to continue to attend their current school rather than start anew making new friends. Jack would continue to pay their fees. They would live in the family home during term time with Jack, and holidays would be divided between both parents. Initially, Diane wanted sole custody. This idea was quickly quashed when the children stayed over for a weekend with their mother and Peter in his flat. There were insufficient bedrooms, so Harry had to sleep in the living room. That forced 2 early nights on Peter and Diane. Georgie harbored a deep resentment against her mother, which manifested itself in her treatment of Peter. Harry was clearly upset about the divorce as well, but he tried to be tolerant, as his dad had told him to be. The tension only added to Diane's stress. Eventually, Diane agreed to a first meeting with the arbitrator, but it didn't go well. She tried to get sole custody in the family home. She still didn't grasp that the house was not Jack's. The arbitrator had a meeting with the children and their parents to determine their views. Eventually, he concluded that the agreement proposed by Mila was eminently fair. Privately, Alan, Diane's solicitor, tended to agree but obviously took his instruction from Diane. The more Diane resisted, the more she found herself on her own. Peter was concerned that she was making herself ill, and he tried to get her to agree to the settlement. At the next meeting, Mila highlighted the share of the boutique that constituted part of the investments being handed over to Diane. When she realized that this element alone gave her the control of her future that she desired, she agreed. Once the settlement was agreed, Jack set about closing all the financial accounts relating to the marriage and opening new ones in his sole name. In doing so, he also reviewed the standing orders and direct debits. He moved those relating to his own outgoings and allowed any relating to Diane's to lapse with the accounts. One of the terms of the settlement was that there would be no child maintenance paid in either direction. It was one of the conditions Mila had inserted to use as a bargaining chip. Diane had initially protested. Mila simply asked how much she wanted and agreed. Diane was very smug about that until she discovered that she was expected to pay the same amount to Jack while the children were with him. Since they would spend more time with him, Diane would suffer a net loss, so that was hurriedly reversed. He set about establishing the routine for the children, using his position in work to allow him to be at home as much as possible for them. Diane would take them for part of the weekend, and Jack would use this to make up time in work. After the children went to bed, he spent much of his time doing the household duties. These posed no problem to him, as he had learned to look after himself in the Navy and was practiced at personal admin. While he was ironing or cleaning, he had plenty of time for introspection. He could find no reason for Diane to reject him except for Peter. Georgie clearly didn't like him, but that appeared to be more to do with him providing a focus for her anger. Harry regarded him as a decent person who seemed to hold Diane in as much affection as did Jack himself. Jack was deeply wounded by the way Diane had simply disposed of him like a used tissue. He had no intention of letting Diane off lightly. The settlement had been about drawing a line under the marriage and a new start, but part of that, for Jack, was to ensure that Diane had as much hurt as she inflicted on him. Ignoble perhaps, but at this stage Jack was still trying to come to terms with what had happened. He didn't have time for much socializing, but he did start investigating the demise of his marriage. When he first met Diane, Jack was struck by her competent manner. She was businesslike and to the point. She dressed appropriately for the site visit and did not trail around like a helpless girlie. She was certainly a looker, but his attention was diverted by the accident. It was the second date before he really thought about her as a possible girlfriend. That kiss at the end of the date had a warmth and passion that aroused him more than physically. She was so easy to be around and really made him feel the center of attention. He wanted to make her feel the same. When she invited him to her bed, he wanted to ensure that she thought of him as a lover, not a sex partner. So he pulled out almost all the stops that night. Well, you want to keep some surprises for later. Gradually, he felt the relationship deepen. He had got the awkward moment of meeting her parents over on the first date. They were very straightforward, normal people. When he decided to ask Diane to marry him, Jack felt that it was appropriate to go through the traditional niceties and asked her father, Sam, for permission first. Sam was as pleased as punch that Jack had gone to the trouble of doing so and gave his blessing willingly. Both he and Betty, Diane's mother, had taken him into their hearts. Diane was appropriately surprised later that evening when Jack went down on one knee on a hill overlooking the sea. She knew, of course, that Jack was going to propose, but the time and place did come as a surprise to her. As an only child, Diane's parents pulled out all the stops. They weren't rich by any stretch of the imagination, but they wanted the best for her. Both Jack and Diane pitched in, of course, but discreetly. The wedding day was everything a girl could hope for, and the honeymoon to the Bahamas was everything a boy could. They chose to get right on with a family, as Diane wanted to have her children while she was young enough to keep up with them. Married life was unexceptional. Jack was a loving and dutiful father, and Diane played her part to perfection. Bedroom activities fluctuated with family needs, but to Jack, they were definitely not on short rations. They explored each other's sexuality to the fullest. Diane knew she had chosen a good lover and father for her children and made sure Jack had no reason to question the stability of the relationship or to feel the need to look elsewhere. It helped that Jack's parents were prepared to look after the children and allow them some adult time every couple of months, and Diane never failed to make those weekends special. Even when they bought the house in Devon and Diane and the children went down for the summer, she ensured that Jack was looking forward to getting back to work for a rest every weekend. For her, the time to change came once the children were both at secondary school. In her own mind, she had proven her feminine credentials, and it was time to resurrect her career. She chose to ease her way back into the real world by starting in a small boutique in town. This way she could redevelop her customer relation skills. It would also put her in touch with a world of glamour and celebrity where she belonged after 15 years in the wilderness. Diane had been with the business for 6 months when she was invited by the two owners of the business to accompany them to a show. Unbeknownst to Diane, this coincided with Jack's purchase, on her behalf, of a 30% share in the business. What she did know was that the owners intended to open a second shop in a nearby town. This event prompted the action, which would eventually lead to divorce. Although she was not by any stretch of the imagination overweight, she felt it. At the exhibition, she was surrounded by stick-thin models, designers, and buyers. All were in the latest styles. Diane felt frumpy. It was as simple as that. She resolved to shed the weight that had not gone after childbearing, and she would update her wardrobe. Then she would take over the business and expand it further. She already had thoughts of a beach and swimwear shop in Devon. To Diane, that meant a trip to Rio. Her first action when she got home was to join the gym. It was not enough to simply lose the weight. She had to tone and shape her body. She engaged one of the personal trainers to develop a program of exercise to meet her requirements. That was how she met Peter. Peter was eye candy, but not a himbo. He had studied sports science and physiotherapy and was a part owner of the gym. He was 29, 6 feet 2 inches tall, slender, but lithe. He moved sinuously, with the grace of a dancer, yet he exuded manliness. Fair-haired, rather than blonde. His blue eyes were darker than Paul Newman's, but had the same roguishness. Diane knew at first sight that this was the man she would need to adorn her arm on buying trips. Jack was still a good-looking man, but in the world of fashion, he would look like a sugar daddy. Diane knew if she was to develop the business, she had to be the one in control, and it had to look that way. So along with her commitment to body sculpting came her campaign to seduce Peter. Initially, the only parts of all this that Jack could establish were the time frame and the fact that Diane was living up to her Greek goddess namesake, Diana the Huntress. This told him what he needed to know. Diane had used both Peter and him. Jack's anger at the hurt caused to him and the children could be focused on Diane. Whatever happened to Peter was collateral damage. People like to talk. Jack had developed the skill of getting people to talk. Putting the two together, he was able to gather a reasonable picture of Diane's actions, but not her reasons. Joining the gym, Jack came into regular contact with Peter. He intended to make Peter uncomfortable. Observing his routine in the gym was a surprise. Peter was very good at his job and treated all his clients in a very proficient manner. Conversing with other users, Jack discovered that all the trainers had a reputation for maintaining a professional distance between themselves and their clients. Not only that, but the gym staff ensured that any predatory behavior was quickly dealt with. Their reputation was that women could use the facilities in safety and comfort. This even extended to the car park, which was well lit and comprehensively covered by CCTV. What he did learn, though, was that Diane had initiated the relationship. She had not been flagrant in her flirting, but the other women had picked up on the signals, even though the men didn't. There had been no activity around the gym, so Jack was unable to establish where the affair had been consummated. Nevertheless, that point was moot. Diane had made it quite clear that he was being replaced, and the result was the divorce. For his part, Peter was unfazed by Jack's presence, to the extent that he even welcomed Jack on their first encounter. He was professional enough to give Jack advice on the use of the equipment and exercises appropriate to help improve the mobility of his arms. Peter even asked for advice on how to help improve the relationship between the children and their mother and him. He was clearly interested in the children's well-being. Despite himself, Jack started to warm to him. In fact, he had to admit that, had Peter been one of his staff, he would have every confidence in him. This rather changed the complexion of Jack's plan. Peter had, to some extent, shown Jack that his primary concern had to be to resolve the children's anxieties and uncertainties. Much to his chagrin, he was also persuaded that Peter did, in fact, love Diane. That he found hardest to bear. Whilst the flame of his own love for her was dying, he had a feeling that the embers would glow for a very long time. That self-knowledge only added to his current pain. Jack was now ashamed of the ignobility of his initial desire for a grand revenge on Diane and Peter. He was embarrassed with himself for making Peter a target for reprisal. Clearly, Peter was as innocent of any wrongdoing, just as were Jack, Harry, and Georgie. Laying all the blame on Diane, however, meant that somewhere along the line he had misjudged his wife and the nature of their marriage. It made him question everything about the past 15 or so years. Revenge, however, can come in many ways. Diane was due to collect the children to take them to the house in Devon for the weekend. Jack had arranged that he and David would have a round of golf and then a night on the town. Jack collected the kids from school and found David waiting for him when he arrived home. Harry and Georgie rushed into the house to change and collect their backpacks for the weekend. Jack lifted his clubs and was loading them into David's car when Diane drove up. She got out of her car in high dudgeon and stormed over to Jack. "Scumsucker!" she screamed, and caught him with a full-blooded slap across the face as he straightened from loading the clubs. She was about to hit him again when he pushed her away. She stumbled backwards and landed heavily on her rump. Peter had just got out of the car and moved to restrain her. "You scumsucker! You did that deliberately!" she screamed again. By this time, the children had appeared with their bags. Jack ruefully rubbed his cheek, wondering what he was supposed to have done. He looked at Diane, who was trying to break free from Peter. Then he looked quizzically at Peter. "I was stopped by the police because my brake light was out." "You scumsucker!" she shrieked. "That's hardly my fault," said Jack. "It's not that, and you know it." "Sorry, Diane. You've lost me." They checked the car tax and it was out of date. Her rant continued. Then they asked for the MOT certificate and my insurance, and they were both out of date too. "Oh dear. And that's my fault, how?" A small smile played over Jack's face as he realized what had happened. Diane redoubled her efforts to break free and continue her assault. "You should have got it tested and renewed the tax and insurance," she shrieked. "Not my problem, honey. It's your car. It always was. You wanted a divorce, so I don't have any responsibility for it. I didn't get any renewal notice." "I see. You didn't tell them about your change of address then. It was getting difficult not to gloat. You should have passed them on to me when they arrived here. Again, not my problem. Anyway, I did. Any mail for you gets sent back to the post office with your new address on it. If they don't redirect it in time, it's nothing to do with me." "You knew." Jack changed the argument. "So you're telling me that car isn't taxed, insured, or tested? I'm afraid you can't have the children then." "What?" she screamed. "I'll take you to court for full custody, you scumsucker." "I'm sorry, but it wouldn't be very responsible of me to let the children go in a car that I knew wasn't roadworthy, Diane." Diane was mouthing apoplectically. You. I think maybe you should call a taxi so you can go and get Peter's car. Assuming it is taxed and everything, that is." Jack looked at Peter, who had a strange look on his face, somewhere between anger and laughter. Fortunately, Diane couldn't see it. "Come on, Diane," he said. "We'll go get my car." And he firmly conducted Diane back to her car. Jack turned to David. "Can we drop the kids off at Peter's so they can have their weekend?" he asked. "Sure, no problem." Then to Peter, "We'll follow you." The children were very quiet on the journey. Jack tried to reassure them that their mum was just angry with him and not them. He didn't want to ruin their weekend. Diane was more than capable of doing that. Having dropped them off, David and Jack headed for the golf club. You devious scumsucker, David chortled. You knew that would happen, didn't you? Not to that degree, admitted Jack. She'll get points on her license as well. Oh dear, too bad. So sad. You're confusing me with someone who gives a shit, laughed Jack. Somewhat hollowly, thought David. Simon and Mila are making a 4-ball with us, then we'll head down the George for dinner. As long as you are paying, I'm a poor divorcee now, you know. David snorted. Jack had a good game, but Simon was a 7 handicap and swept the board. Dinner was fun, and they all danced with Mila at some stage in the evening. David and Jack danced with a few other women as well. At the end of the night, Jack went home to an empty house. He checked the horses before retiring. Next morning, he woke to a lonely silence and spent the morning tending to the animals and the domestic chores. He was about to take each of the horses out in turn for some exercise when Mila turned up with her nieces. I thought you could do with a hand exercising the beasts, she explained. They spent a pleasant afternoon hacking through the countryside. Mila noted, however, that Jack's bonhomie was a little forced. Why don't you come over for dinner this evening? She offered. Thanks, Mila, but I'm going to have to learn to live with it.